Rachel Robbins is here. She's speaking about her book, The Sound of 1,000 Stars. Very excited to hear her story, to hear her family's story, and how it made its way into this book. Rachel she has received her MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and she is a tenured assistant professor at Malcolm X College, one of the city colleges in Chicago. So she joins us tonight from Chicago. She said it was snowing on her way out of town. Hopefully some of that snow comes our way sometime soon. And we're very excited. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. Okay, can you guys hear me? Oh, all right. Hi. Thank you so much, you guys, for coming out on a phoneless, internetless holiday. I'm so happy to see you. And really, it's such a pleasure to be back here. So I haven't been here since my book launch, which was last October. And I think because at the time I was still very much in the fog of new motherhood, I wasn't as nervous because I was just so tired. And so being here tonight, I had the pleasure of going to dinner with the lovely folks from Los Alamos Historical Society. So thank you so much. You guys are a wonderful crew, and it was a pleasure. But I'm much more nervous this time around because this is such a special place, and I'm just honored to be here with you all. You're living history, and my book is kind of a nod to my grandmother's book, which came first. So my grandmother, Phyllis Fisher, was married to Leon Fisher, and they worked on the project. And she published a book of her letters home in 1985, but she never presented it here in Los Alamos. And so I feel, in a sense, like it's a homecoming for her story that I'm getting to share it all with you tonight. So it's very special, very humbling. So this is my novel, The Sound of 1,000 Stars, which came out last October. And I'm gonna start by doing what you're never supposed to do, which is like getting behind the smoke and mirrors and telling you guys how publishing works, which is that you don't get to keep your title. Like you get a working title that you might have fallen in love with that I worked on for a decade, and then they were like, oh, no, they won't get that. It's too heady, right? So I actually wanted to call my book Enola Spelled Backwards, which I thought was smart, but they said not. But Enola, of course, was a nod to the Enola Gay. And I was just very interested in the fact that that name, that Enola spelled backwards, is a loan, but also that Paul Tibbets named that plane after his mother, who was in turn named after the titular character of Enola or Her Fatal Mistake by Marianne Rittenbaugh. Then also I have to say, as a mom, I was like, how would I feel? Like if that plane had been named after me. So I was really immersed in that. And then my editor was like, no, that's not gonna work. So we went with The Sound of 1,000 Stars, which I had in my back pocket. And I do love this title because it's a nod, of course, to Oppenheimer and the Bhagavad Gita. And Fred J. Olivy's soundbite on the evening news after his plane boxcar had dropped the second bomb in Nagasaki, he said, suddenly the light of 1,000 suns illuminated the cockpit. So I do like that it has that numerical reference, right? That also said, it's a paradox, because, how many of you all in here are in science and physics, right? Like, you know that there's no sound in outer space. So it's a paradox. It's about that wanting to get to the unknowable, wanting to get to the edge of the known universe. And so I really loved that as kind of a, memorial for my grandparents. Here's my grandma. She's fabulous, isn't she? Like, come on. The world is falling apart. The world is at war. She can't tell her family where she is. This was taken circa 1944. And this is the magic of coming here and visiting you all, is that I didn't know until I was here last October, but someone in the audience said this looked like bandolier. Do you guys all agree? Yeah, so I also just love that she is that, smizing at the camera, able to look so youthful and energetic. I say youthful now that I'm not as youthful as I once was, but in the midst of being a mom in this very trying time. And so she left me these documents that I have spent, so she passed away in 2009, my grandfather passed away in 2012. I started this book on the flight home from his memorial. I didn't know it was a book at the time, I was just missing my grandpa. But in writing that story down, I didn't realize how much I was diving into in terms of going through all of her copies of her original letters, and she also gave me all of these documents and pictures. And so these photos I'm about to show you are photos that my grandmother saved for all those years. They actually aren't photos she took. You may be familiar with some of them. them. They are stamped on the back with Los Alamos National Laboratory, and she used them in her book, but they weren't her property. And I, as a visual artist as well, am really in love with the fact that these photos were yellowed by time, that they were smudged, they were tarnished, and so I wanted to, instead of giving you guys the crisp shots I could have gotten online, these are actually scanned from her originals that got messed up, and the pages were stuck closed, and the archives would be mad at me, I'm sure, for the way that I maintained them. But so here is a picture of armed guards patrolling the area around Los Alamos. And I can't help but look at this one and think about Oppenheimer riding around on his aptly named thoroughbred Crisis, and what that must have been like. My grandmother, part of the reason I had to set her free as a fictional character is because a lot of her writing was very much in the weeds of the day-to-day life on the project. And after 1,000 pages that I had to throw away, I was like, okay, it has to be a page turner, I get it, right? But she wrote a lot about the mangle. She really hated the mangle, so that's what this is. This is the barracks hospital where he's not here tonight, I thought maybe he would be, my Uncle Larry was born. I also have an Uncle Bob who was on the project as a small child. And this is where we kind of part ways, I think, with nonfiction and fiction, because I did this kind of process of loosening the constraints, which is that in my book, I wanted my reader to have a first row seat to the irradiation of Louis Slotin and Harry Daghlian, and so I have my characters visiting in this hospital. Of course, as you guys probably all know, in this community, you couldn't actually visit unless you were a spouse, and even then it was during visiting hours, right? So what you're looking at, if my grandmother had had her baby in the middle of the night, she'd be out of luck. My grandpa couldn't be there. But what you're looking at is people parking their cars and then shouting through the windows. And when I went to write the book, I thought, that's not something that's going to work in a chapter. And then later, COVID happened, and we were attending funerals on Zoom, and I think it hit differently, just that sheer isolation, right? So I wanted to make sure I include that in my historical notes, that it's important to me that some of it's fiction and some of it's fact, and that we distinguish that, especially in our current climate. All right, so this one, I have to give a shout out to Liz Martineau and Gordon, that when we did our conversation last October, we were looking at this photograph, and Gordon says, it was just called research experiments, and if you look at it closely, it doesn't look quite safe, right? What's going on here? But that this is actually a woman on the left side of the image, and that's Norma Gross, but that she was incorrectly recorded as Norman Gross in many historical documents. And to me, that just really hit home with the reason I felt the need to center a female scientist and write a book about women in STEM. This whole idea of the term women scientists, that we presume scientist is male. And I don't know that it's that different now. So I really wanted this book to be a tribute to, as I did all this research and celebrated my grandma's legacy, also all these other amazing women whose stories I came across. All right, so not much of this made it into my book, but the water shortage was a major feature for my grandmother. She thought about this a lot. Lots of writing about frozen pipes, lots of writing about the water tower, right? And I'm actually going to read a little bit of what she had to say, and she was, you guys will get a sense really quickly, she was so funny. So she's trying to convince her mother after security constraints were loosened, she asked her mother to come visit, right? And in trying to convince her was also like, well, there's this water shortage, but don't worry, it'll be okay. And so she said this about the water tower. She said, they'd been instructed by military via notice, and here's the notice. Fire protection and sanitation are of the utmost importance. Be especially watchful for fires. And then my grandmother scribbled, what do we do if we see one? Without water, watch. And then the notice went on, suspend all bathing except emergency. And she said, when does it become an emergency? Bill Ogle suggests stinkometers be placed, one in the tech area and one in the commissary. And then it said, water trucks will be parked between the hospital and the water tower. And she wrote, pretty embarrassing for the water tower. So this woman just needed a book to be written about her. Here is the entrance to the tech area. I'll show you a couple other quick snapshots that she had saved. This is the commissary. Of course, these are staged. Excuse my sniffling, I'm traveling with small children. And of course, the mud was a central feature in her letters. The mud, she was calling it moon rock. She complained about the mud in front of her various homes as she moved from home to home, and she couldn't get into her house. Cars sinking in the mud, flat tires in the mud, right? We know the stories, main gate. And she hated how rigid the rules were. There's a story about her trying to take her dog to the vet, and her car got a flat tire, and they wouldn't let her walk through the gate, but she could drive through the gate because the security was so strict, and so she wrote a lot about this. Here's what was stamped on the back of all these photos. So it's kind of a mystery. I should lead with the fact that although my grandmother wrote a book, we never talked about it. And I think this is an interesting thing. I think there's a little bit of that, like you try to protect your kids thing. I also don't know, like I was talking to my mom who's with my kids right now, so she's not here, so I can talk about her. But there's that thing of like, you know, maybe we just didn't ask. It's like you're not curious about your parents, right? And so I started going through these documents and realized that some of these were things she'd actually taken. So I believe these are her photographs now. This was labeled the Black Mesa. Maybe some of you recognize, you know, the area better than me. The area around Los Alamos, very vague on that one. This is just Mesa, 1945. That's all I got. And then this is Katie Goldsby at the archives was helping me with some of this as I was donating some documents. And, you know, my grandmother would have been in a McKeeville style house. And she would have had a home kind of like this, one of these flat top homes, right? And this is another place that I departed from nonfiction because my character was a single woman. She would have been in a woman's dormitory, not a house. And I wanted her to be in a house for a few reasons. It would have been a lot harder to write the sex scenes if she'd been sharing her space, right? But also, it's important to note that she wouldn't have had a phone, right? Even living in this house, she wouldn't have had a phone. She would have been waiting in line for a payphone. And I didn't want my readers to have to wait in line. And now, looking back on that isolation in a world where we have more phones than we could possibly ever want, and I think it makes us more lonely, I think that's an interesting thing, right? That we mark ourselves safe if there's a wildfire. And there's this network we tap into, and we had a little taste of that today, what that's like when you lose it. And it's disorienting, right? Really stressful. I brought my phone up here out of habit. It's not going to do anything. So this is her photograph from 1944, which I think is so interesting to see those houses before the fences went up, and that dirt road. This is the security handbook that I donated last year. I'm bringing a couple other letters along with me this trip to donate that my mom finally agreed to let go of. She was holding on to her mother's handwriting, which I can't blame her for, right? But this is like, you know, the inane security rules that she really pushed back on of what you could take photographs of and what you could say. And, you know, if you saw a stranger who you already knew in Santa Fe, you could give a partial smile and a half nod and nothing more. Those kind of rules. That's all in there. This we found actually in my grandfather's safety deposit box after he passed away. It's a mystery to me. He saved it all those years, right? But he certainly didn't frame it and put it on the wall. And I think in writing this book, I was very much trying to get at the heart of how my grandfather felt about his work and what he'd done. We know how my grandmother felt. She wrote about it a lot. But I still don't really know where he was coming from. And so here's his certificate that he saved, and here's a scan of what was his actual A-bomb pin. Here's my grandma, young and fresh-eyed, following him without knowing where they were going, a town without a name. There's my grandpa, Leon Fisher. And this was actually Katie again in the archives, helped me locate their actual home. You can see Fisher written there, T670, Leon H. Fisher. And so when I was here last, I did a lot of exploring and was able to find, with the help of Liz, the home approximate place where their house would have been. Of course, all the roads are facing different directions and nothing looks the same anymore, but to look up at the mountains and see like these might have been the same mountains, the same perspective that they might have looked at was pretty magical. And we took a rock home to put on my grandfather's grave. This is comical. This is my grandmother's idea of what her home was going to look like in Los Alamos before she got there. And you can see the crib is like a big focus because she's dealing with having a young child and about to be pregnant with another. And none of this came to fruition, as you guys can imagine. Here are a few of her letters. She called Los Alamos Shangri-La, which I love. After James Hilton, Lost Horizon, is this idea of the Himalayas, but it's a plane that gets lost, and it's far away, high up, and outside of time. So I thought that was a beautiful nickname, or like expression of how she felt living here. She also sometimes referred to it as Never Never Land. And you know, everyone was young, right? Here are some of those letters. I won't read all of these, I have a lot, but I just want to put a couple examples of what she went through, you know. Dear Mom and Dad, and this is the thing with her book, you have to know that her letters, she's trying to put her parents at ease, right? Like, it's okay, but you can hear kind of the terror behind the front she's putting on. She says, we're moving, believe me, you're not any more surprised than I. Lee wandered in tonight, casually tossed his briefcase on the couch and remarked calmly, well, let's see, graduation is on the 25th, so we could leave on the 26th. Then, as an afterthought, or maybe just to be chummy, couldn't we? Wouldn't you like to know where we're going? Confidentially, so would I. And it isn't that Lee won't tell me, he doesn't know either. She goes on to say that Lee is asking for a file baked in a cake. Don't worry, I'm just kidding. I don't know its name, and I couldn't tell you if I did know. Please don't say anything to anyone yet, at least until I tell you what you can or should say. I just read this much of the letter, and I bet you're convinced, Mom, that I've gone completely mad, that these are the ravings of the insane, right? So I can only imagine what this letter must have been like to receive. Also, you see all her edits on it, and personally, I love this because she was revising it for her book. So as an author, I'm super interested in that revision of what stayed and what went, but it also made it very confusing to know what actually was the original letter. She retyped and retyped obsessively, so I have hundreds of copies of each letter. I'll write all I can about Shangri-La. Please understand that if I don't answer your questions, there's a reason. I have been told that our mail, both incoming and outgoing, will be censored. If my letters have even less coherence than usual, please blame it on the rules and regulations of the Never Never Land. All right, here's my Uncle Bob. He's not here, so I can make fun. He was a really cute kid who got into a lot of trouble. He was digging up cactuses, he got spanked by a neighbor. I have so much writing about this guy and what he did as a kid. And there's also this very problematic dog that she had named Fawn, who attacked people. It's a very cute dog, very bad dog. They bit the mailman. They eventually had to give it to a bus driver who lived down the hill because they couldn't keep the dog because it was biting people. So, and my grandma was an animal lover, so this must have broken her heart. Like, you know, to have to give up after all of this and then give up your dog, right? Here she is with Uncle Bob. And I do think with writing this book, I kept trying and trying and trying, and then I just think, you know, it hit different after having a baby during COVID. Not that it's the same, of course, right? But just the isolation and the first baby. Right? It was so much. And so looking back at these, I just see it differently. She goes on trying to convince them that she's gonna like it here. She complains about, she calls her house a cracker box variety house. She makes fun of all the houses. I love that you can see here that our address after October 26th will be Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. And here she is hiking. My publisher, when they were promoting the book, they wanted to use this picture. They thought it was great, but it's not my grandpa. So I was like, you guys, it's a lie. It's just some dude, we don't know who he is. Maybe someone in here recognizes this guy, because you know, groupthink, but I don't know who that is. He's holding her dog too, which that dog didn't let people hold it, so it must have been a friend. Here is my grandpa. I think it is so funny that all of these old photos, he is never wearing a shirt. Like, not the grandpa that I knew. Look at that, handsome guy. And here she is going skiing. She, wrote a lot about hiking and loving nature and the beauty of the, surrounding alpine settlement. Here she's complaining about the move in the floor plan. You can tear up the floor plan I gave you. She's very upset about that. And she says, I still think I'll like it here. Does my voice sound just a wee bit shaky? So that mother of hers, my great-grandmother Helen, did come visit after things were declassified. So here she is with a slightly older Uncle Bob hiking. And here he is being adorable but causing problems. And then this, I'm not actually going to open her book to page 99 and read you, I'm just going to tell you the story. You should read her book if you're interested. But, okay, so their last name is Fisher, and she was with my grandfather. And I know people had their different ways of handling the secrecy and the security in their private home spaces, right? My grandfather was very tight-lipped. His whole life he was tight-lipped, and not just about Los Alamos, about everything. And so with baby names, you know, he never told her what he was working on. She must have had some sense, right? The joke was like windshield wipers for submarines. I'm sure you guys have heard and come across these things. But they were coming up with baby names, and she said, well, what if we name the baby Uranium? Which, I don't know, when I was coming up with baby names, that name did not occur to me. So I think that maybe she was onto him in some way, I just don't know. But so she said, how about we name the baby Uranium Fisher? And my grandfather, who was very mild-mannered, well, mild-mannered when I knew him, he was a little more intense as a young man, he stormed out of the room and slammed the door and didn't come home that night. And so she went and looked in his books and looked up and found uranium fission and went, oh my God. But then even then, they didn't talk about it until after the bomb fell on August 6th, and they heard everything with Truman's announcement at 11 a.m. And so it's just this incredible story that she's got in her book of how she found out what he was doing, and even then, this wall of silence between them. And here, I have this one in here just to give you an example of why I felt the need to fictionalize this story. So here we have, this is just the tone of these letters is so bananas. So she goes, Dear Mom and Dad, good riddance to Mussolini and Hitler. No one here is mourning for either of them. That's sure, I guess Mussolini had it coming. Very dramatic, though, that he should be shot to death by his own Italians who adored their Il Duce not so long ago. I wonder who conceived the idea of hanging him with his mistress upside down in the public square. And then she just flips, so what's new, closer to home? Well, there's Diablo, a most exciting acquisition, a tame little burro, purchased by 5 couples here so the kids can ride him. So it was just this pinprick of her daily life, right? And then she just flips back to like being a mom and a person. And in figuring out the tone of that in a story, I had to get away from being beholden to what had really occurred, to her actual, what kind of plants were in her yard, and what actually happened on that day, what the weather was like. And it was a little scary, setting her loose on the page and seeing what happened. But I do think, and I stand by this, that I think that going into fiction actually allowed me to get closer to the emotional truth of what my grandmother might have really gone through. Here, you know, I'm an English professor. Every English professor loves a good typo, right? So here's the famous Santa Fe, New Mexican. Now they can be told aloud those stories of the hill. She saved all of these. I have so many newspapers from her. And she followed Oppenheimer's career for the rest of her life, saved every newspaper that she could find. And then in her writing and essays about the book, she started to get more real. So it's not in the book itself, but here she wrote a little bit about her postpartum depression and anxiety that she had after her second child, my Uncle Larry, was born. And she said, my pregnancy was beset with problems, partly due to my emotional state at that time. The delight of preparing for our baby was tempered by the realization that he would live his entire life in the nuclear age with all that might mean. Would he ever know a world free from fear? What kind of future could we offer him? I even wondered if he had the right, knowing what we did, to bring a baby into a world that had already sown the seeds of its own destruction. Larry, born in January 1946, was a sickly baby during the first year of his life, possibly having suffered from the effects of the anxiety and depression I had been feeling. We left Los Alamos in the summer of 1946, taking with us memories of pungent mountain air, fantastic landscapes, and wonderful friendships. Shangri-La was no more, but could we leave behind the experiences of hope and despair, of laughter and solemnity, of thrills and aggravations? I wonder how many left as we did, with the feeling that the specter of the mushroom cloud would follow us wherever we went. This is not the grandmother that I knew. She never talked to me about this, right? And then again, having my own child during COVID and dealing with that isolation, I found these letters and it just meant a lot to me. Okay, you also have to know that her book, The Los Alamos Experience, was translated into Japanese. she was very proud of the fact that it was the first book, at least so she said, on Los Alamos that was published in Japanese. And it was published in '85, which to me is really progressive, considering that we didn't have a US president who visited Hiroshima until Barack Obama in 2016. They also moved to Japan for several years together, so here you can see the entirety of the book. Some of the pictures I already showed you in Japanese. Here she is at the cenotaph, Hiroshima Peace Park. And there's the actual photograph, which I have, right? And there they are in Japan they were in 3 years. And so I grew up in this very weird niche world where we're a Jewish family, we had a house full of Japanese keepsakes. And I just never questioned it, because you're a kid, you go, that's home, right? But so I didn't start looking at this and going, what's going on here, until much later. All right. The best part of writing a book is interviewing people. And in the process of researching this book, I didn't get to ask my grandparents the questions I so wish I had asked them, but I did interview his still living friends and asked questions I wouldn't have asked otherwise. So in that process, I interviewed 2 different SEDs who were really good friends with my grandfather. One who I just fell in love with is Ben Peterson. He passed away a couple years back. And he was, 19 at the time. And he really didn't like the military. He was very anti, having been pulled out of what he wanted to do, which was be a physics major as an undergraduate. And so he did all sorts of things to cause trouble. And in the barracks, he realized he could get through the army never having to make his bed if he just slept on top of his sheets instead of in them. So he just slept on his sheets. And then a bunch of these guys stole electrical parts from the tech area and made all sorts of weird contraptions to play music, so they could blast music, because there was terrible radio stations that only played cowboy music. So he was very proud of this. This was how hard it was for him to get permission to get a civilian pair of shoes. They had to jump through these hoops to get permission to do that. So he was really proud of this document. More so, he was proud of this, which is his recommendation letter signed by J.R. Oppenheimer himself. So he really wanted me to see that. Okay, so here's where I started realizing I needed to write this book in fiction, is Ben Peterson, when I was interviewing him, pulled out the diary he had kept, and he'd kept a very rigid diary practice the whole time he was in Los Alamos. He wrote every day. And he not only worked with my grandfather on their particular project, but he went to Tinian, he helped train the pilots, and then on August 6, 1945, when he heard Truman's announcement, he wrote how he felt about it in his diary the night before, and then he looked at his diary the next day, and he said, "My God, what have I done?" And he was smoking a cigarette at the time, and so he took his cigarette and he burned a hole through his diary. And that diary's been lost. I've gotten in touch with his adult children, and we can't find it. It's somewhere in New York City, in a basement. But we have the digitized version of it, which we sent to the archives. But to me, I was handed a book with a physical hole in it. And so then I felt like my iteration of this, my next attempt, was going to be to try to stitch that hole back together. And so that's how I ended up writing The Sound of a Thousand Stars. And if you guys are not too bored and tired, you don't have phones anyway, what else are you going to do? I'd like to read a little bit of it. So it's a dual perspective. Alice is my main character, very closely based on my grandmother in terms of personality, but also a mishmash of these amazing women that I came across in my research. And so this is July 16th, 1945. Alice Katz did not exist. She was a rumor holding a stopwatch. In 12 seconds, she would be lost to all of history, swallowed up by New Mexico. T-minus 12, T-minus 11, T-minus 10. She heard Sam Allison's familiar voice counting down. She surveyed the network of crisscrossed wires entangling her in the cottage, an elaborate spider web. She fidgeted with the Geiger counter on the windowsill and adjusted the dial on the shortwave radio, trying to tune away the static. Alice had passed the witchy hours while New Mexico slept, studying the storm through the window, trying to see the empty desert through sheets of rainwater. When the night sky quieted, residual raindrops rolled slowly down the window pane, and her mind recited theories of cohesion and adhesion as she watched the water molecules interact. Water is attracted to water, she mumbled. water is attracted to other substances. She thought about how in outer space, raindrops will be perfectly round spheres, but here on Earth, gravity weighed down the spheres, the shapes, into teardrops. Here on Earth, she thought, that phrase might mean something very different soon. T-9, T-8, T-7, Sam counted through the radio. Alice felt like some mythological beast with 2 beating hearts. The fetus was already the size of a laboratory beaker and it was growing. She had heard once somewhere that pregnant mothers were at once 1 and also 2. T-6, T-5. The radio stuttered into white noise. She braced, knowing that in a matter of seconds, either a second sun would rise on the horizon or it would be the end of the world. At the edges of her vision, she noticed that the trees were shining gold. Okay, so it's a dual perspective story with Caleb, who is the SED, and Alice, who is the women scientist. But I also felt the need, and this is something I thought about a lot, to introduce a Japanese character. And so I wrote the story of Haruki Seido, who is very closely based on a real hibakusha, Suneo Tsuboi, who was the co-chair of the Nihon Heidenkyo for most of his career. And he, it's all kind of like been washed over in what's happened in the news since. But right before the election, they won the the Peace Prize, right? And so I thought that was really amazing, but it also was a little bit of too little, too late, in that he didn't live to see this happen with his life's work. But I also really wanted to be careful with this story. And so I went and I got a sensitivity reader, which is my oldest best friend from childhood, who had moved back to Tokyo after we were kids chasing each other on the playground, not speaking the same language. And I asked her to read the book and tell me if I could keep the storyline, what I was getting wrong, what she thought. And she got back to me and she gave me some things that she wanted me to change. And then she said, all those years we were friends, I never knew that your grandfather worked on the bomb. My grandfather lived in Hiroshima and was sent away on business the week of the bombing, and that's why he survived. And all of our lives, we've been friends, we've never discussed it. And so that's when I said, I really need this storyline to be in there, because I don't want to raise my daughter in a world where she doesn't talk to her friends about where they come from, and these intersections in their ancestries. So this is an excerpt from Haruki's story, and his story is told in reverse. It's a story told backwards. This is March of 1967. Haruki could feel the heat of the doctor's stare. You may want to contact a minister about last rites, he said, eyeing Haruki quizzically as he awaited a response. The doctor was young and sharply dressed with a fresh haircut. He had his whole life before him. Usually, when I tell someone they're dying, they have a few questions. I've been told I was terminal 3 times, muttered Haruki. What I'm saying is it's a good idea to get your affairs in order. It's time to make final arrangements. Gather a last will and testament, power of attorney. Although he sat perfectly still on the crinkly brown hospital paper, Haruki had the sensation of wind running through his hair. He imagined himself on the hill of blowing purple azaleas where he had buried Shinju. They had come here to die once before. Death can be a burden on the living, the doctor was saying. But Haruki wasn't listening. He was distracted by the smell of salt in the air. In his mind's eye, he could make out the red spires of the Ondo Bridge, Shinju's final resting place overlooked Ondo no Seto in the Seto Inland Sea, which connects the main island of Japan and the Kurahashi Island. It was a tourist trap down there in the hustle and bustle of honking taxis and drifting ferries, but from so high up, he was alone with the wind. He could see the whole strait. The spring flowers had bloomed in falling clouds of pink and purple. He realized the doctor was waiting for him to say something. I died on August 6, 1945, he said. I may have left Hiroshima, but I will never leave Hiroshima. He might have still been breathing, but he was already buried beside her. Okay, and you're supposed to leave them wanting more and all less. So I'm going to just do one more, and then I promise I'll stop. One other major character in the book is Richard Feynman. I'm sure you guys are all familiar. So there's this term presentism when we're writing, where you're supposed to not imbue contemporary ethics into your characters, right? You're thinking about who they really would have been at that time. And I was trying to really let Richard, who's Dick Feynman in the book, be who he was, a young man in love with a wife who's dying of tuberculosis down the hill, right? That said, if he were around today, Richard Feynman probably would be Me Too'd for having posed as an undergrad to sleep with students. He had students meet him in strip clubs for quote conferences, and his wife cited abuse. And his books are so charming. I'm sure you guys have read some of them. Like, they're so funny, but it is interesting to then look back at kind of the patriarchal culture that made that offbeat quirkiness charming, and that he's this celebrity, this kind of cult of personality where he's the face of Apple's Think Different campaign, and he's in the syndicated TV show Big Bang Theory as like a hero, right, that one of the characters aspires to. And to think about how we tell the stories of the past is something I really spend a lot of time thinking about. And I think it can be more than one thing. Not to be a good guy or a bad guy. We're complicated, right? So I wanted to just get inside the moment, not cast judgment. So I tried to portray him as a young guy in love with a wife who's dying. That said, I was pretty scathing in my historical notes of him, so make sure you read those. So here we are back again, July 1945, the Trinity test where we started with Alice. At 5:30 a.m., 5 men threw the safety switches and sprinted for their Jeeps. One by one, everyone at base camp shielded their eyes with wellness glasses, except for Dick. Dick, Caleb nudged him, you'll go blind. Dick continued to stare hard at the horizon, and Caleb realized that was the point. His friend was heartbroken. Arlene had weeks left at best. To him, the world was ending, whether the test worked or not. No wonder he had thrown himself so relentlessly into this work that would precipitate Armageddon. It was suicide. They all lay face down in the sand, turned 180 degrees away from the blast for safety. It looked like a war zone. Suddenly, an otherworldly white light filled the sky from corner to corner. It pulsed. The dark of night transformed into the light of morning. The light was so blinding that Caleb was certain they had miscalculated and blown up the world. Then came a sudden blast, so intense they all covered their heads with their hands. Even through his dark glasses, Caleb had never seen anything so bright. It took nearly 40 seconds before the detonation hit him like a strong gust of wind. A mass of flames rose in the distance. Even from 10 miles away, he could feel the heat on the exposed parts of his skin. There were flashes contained inside the massive fireball of heat and ignition. The fire pooled into a pillar of smoke with a horrific mushroom shape, casting an evil shadow over the morning. A full minute and a half later, an enormous bang ricocheting off the mountains, the world's first man-made thunder. Caleb stared at the dust cloud shimmering outward in concentric rings like rippling water. The shape reminded him of the body's circulatory system, bicycle tires in the mud, tree rings in the woods, the weeping rings inside an onion, and the yolk sac in Alice's womb. He struggled to see his own hands and feet in the ash it kicked up, but it was like he had no body. He'd become the dark cloud. For many hours after, Caleb saw a purple splotch after image. For days, he saw that purple splotch every time he closed his eyes. And for many months, before he fell asleep at night, he heard Oppenheimer mumbling in Sanskrit as those final seconds ticked down. The good deeds a man has done before defend him. Thank you.
Rachel, can you tell us what your mom thought about the book, about her mom?
I was not prepared for that question. You would think I would be. Hi Mom, you're gonna watch this on YouTube. So I kept this book a secret, kind of like my grandpa. I didn't let anyone in my family read it. It's very different. My new book I'm sharing with everyone and like begging people to read it. This one I did not let anyone in because I was so very afraid they were gonna take it away or make me change things. My mom, I think it means a lot to her now. I think at the time, it was hard for her to differentiate between fiction and fact, right? Like she would go, this is not something Grandma would have done. And I said, but it's not Grandma, it's this woman that I made up. And she wanted me at one point, oh my gosh, we were already like a couple weeks out from publication, you could pre-order the book. And she said, oh, but you have to change the characters' names. Like, it's too close. And so there was this sense of needing to protect herself and her family, I think, that she still felt very strongly about. And I was like, well, if anyone looks this up, they're gonna know, right? But so I changed the names. It means a lot to her, I think, to be here and to feel connected to their past, because it's something for her that she also never got to ask about while they were alive. Thank you, that's a really good question.
All right, well, you will have an opportunity to talk to Rachel. She's going to go to the back and get ready for a book signing. So if you have a book and you'd like to have it signed, and we also have books for sale in the back. And if you just want to ask some questions, please stop by the table and do that. And thank you again for coming out this evening, and we hope to see you at the next one.